in 1659, the Portuguese, now bosom buddies, handed over Bombay to the English as a marriage dowry, and Charles II soon leased out his new holdings in India to the company, who fortified it and made Bombay their new headquarters, because Surat was coming under increasingly frequent attacks by Marathan Hindu insurgents that proved to be a continuous thorn in Aurangzeb's side. This new Mughal emperor, Aurangzeb, was for the most part absorbed in suppressing rebellions and extending his own empire, and at first paid little attention to the mutual wrangling of Europeans on his periphery. As long as trade continued to profit his empire and pirate activity was minimal, he left them to their own devices. But as the company opened new trading posts along the Indian coast, its directors insisted that their firman, or Sultan's charter, that exempted them from tax duties at Surat, actually extended to all their factories, particularly since the emperor seemed unable to permanently secure the safety of that port. Local governors, port authorities and customs officials, long having established a symbiotic relationship with the company and keen on stimulating foreign investment, had a good thing going, and typically overlooked this wishful English interpretation of its trade charter. When Aurangzeb eventually re-established the jizya, or poll tax on infidels that I mentioned earlier, the company lobbied hard to insist they were exempt from these taxes too, since under Islamic law, such a tax was only to be levied on permanent citizens and not temporary residents or merchants. When the company tried to negotiate opening a factory in Bengal province in the east, its governor, more hard-line than most, not only denied the English the exemptions they were claiming, but also now applied the Infidel Levy on top. A flurry of furious correspondence ensued, ending unfavourably for the till now generously spoiled English. It may be that the empire increasingly saw the Portuguese as not only politically irrelevant, but militarily impotent, and with their new alliance to the English, the East India Company no longer served to counter Portuguese influence, and were now themselves dispensable as far as the Sultan was concerned. Aurangzeb needed all this extra cash to fight Hindu insurgents, so local businessmen were unable to negotiate a solution, with the company now upping the ante by taking matters into their own hands, blockading the recalcitrant governor's ports and raiding Mughal shipping to the Red Sea, just like the Portuguese had done a century before. It worked for them, so why not for us? While it's easy to take that kind of expediently simple explanation, and it may well be partially true, there was another, more serious reason why the company took such a drastic and extraordinarily foolhardy gamble for the mere sake of a couple of % less profit. You see, there were some serious problems now facing the company board of directors back home in London. Charles II had died, and his brother James II had ascended the throne in 1685. He was an outright Catholic, with a personal popularity at rock bottom, so he needed all the friends he could get. The company, too, was now coming under increasing public scrutiny for their blatantly obvious insider trading, which prompted a number of parliamentarians to call for its charter to be dissolved, its monopoly to be broken, and Asian trade opened up to all competitors. As you can imagine, its share price fell through the floor, and the board of directors bribed politicians left, right and centre to block dissolution bills being put before Parliament, with the King's Court doing what they could to keep their backers in business. The public eventually got wind of it, and the printing presses were running hot with articles denouncing the entire business. Desperation in the boardroom in London was now compounded by a loss of tax exemptions in India that threatened to eat into their bottom line. Subsequent parliamentary audits of the company's books revealed that there was a long line of outstretched palms that needed to be continually greased, from port authorities in India to politicians and even the royal family back home. At any moment, the gravy train could come to a grinding halt, and the directors, notably its CEO, Josiah Child, took extreme measures to prevent this from happening, even convincing the king to grant the company extraordinary powers to mint coins, raise troops, and even wage war, as well as negotiate treaties on the Crown's behalf without any prior consultation. They even convinced King James to dispatch an armed fleet to serve their interests. So when the company began blockading Mughal ports and raiding local shipping lanes, things got hot very quickly in what we know today as the First Anglo-Mughal War, or more simply, Child's War. Despite ongoing negotiations with Aurangzeb's government, English raiding continued, blockading Red Sea pilgrim routes, which was something that really raised the ire of the emperor, who now paused his wars with the Hindu insurgents and directed his troops to seize and confiscate all company outposts and assets throughout the entire country. The massively outnumbered English were soon reduced to just their fortress on Bombay, which was now blockaded by a formidable new Mughal fleet assembled by their brilliant admiral Sidi Yaqub Khan. The blockade lasted a year before the starving English surrendered in complete humiliation and begged the emperor not to expel them, promising instead to pay substantial compensation and consent to whatever penalties and taxation rates he demanded. It could have been the end of the English presence in India, there and then, and you have to wonder what the world would be like today had Aurangzeb banished them. But as it happened, he didn't, and having extracted a hefty fine and promises of better behaviour in the future, he not only returned their assets and outposts, but also, astonishingly, their previous trading privileges. Was he a sucker? Perhaps, but more likely he was so engrossed in his domestic wars of conquest against the Hindu that he felt the English were barely a nuisance that could just as easily be crushed the next time they got cocky. The English, just like the Portuguese before them, also now promised to patrol the seas against pirates, and we know that this was a major consideration for the emperor too. By the way, this wasn't the last time the English would sit precariously on the edge of expulsion, but again,